Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Macmillan Center. I'm Ian Shapiro. Currently, I have responsibility for directing the Macmillan Center, and one of the most interesting and fun aspects of that job is to invite and introduce the Coca-Cola World Fund lecturer. We're delighted to host Ibu Patel as the speaker for this year. It's actually I was just noticing the Coca-Cola World Fund lecture at Yale was created in 1992. So with Ibu's presentation, it actually comes of age. This is the 21st year of the Coca-Cola lecture. It was established by the late Roberto Gutierrez, who was at that time the chair and CEO of the Coca-Cola Foundation, and he was an alumnus of Yale College class of 1953. His ambition was to support the intersecting endeavors among specialists in international relations, international law, and the management of international enterprises and organizations. The Macmillan Center sponsors this event along with the law school and the School of Management. Ibu Patel is the founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Corps in Chicago. Growing out of the community organizing Ibu did there, the Interfaith Youth Corps capitalizes on the positive force of faith to bring young people of diverse backgrounds together and empower communities. He was named by U.S. News and World Report as one of America's best leaders of 2009. And Ibu is the author of books Sacred Ground, Pluralism, Prejudice, and the Promise of America, and his 2007 autobiography, Acts of Faith, the story of an American Muslim and the struggle for the soul of a generation, which won the Louisville Grahamman Award for Religion. He's also a regular contributor, as I'm sure many of you know, to the Washington Post, USA Today, Huffington Post, NPR, and CNN. Ibu is also a member of President Obama's advisory, another community organizer from Chicago, President Obama, Advisory Council of the White House Office for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. His lecture today will run for about 40 to 45 minutes, which will then give us time for some discussion, questions and answers, and we'll aim to wind up by about 5:30, after which everybody will be invited to join us for a reception outside. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to invite you to welcome you here today. The title that Ibu has chosen for his lecture is Religious Conflict, Religious Cooperation Toward a Field of Interfaith Studies. I'm pleased to introduce Ibu Patel.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I'm honored. So I take special joy in speaking at campuses that I was not smart enough to get into as an undergrad, of which Yale is probably top of that list. So thank you all for coming this afternoon. Thank you to Professor Shapiro for hosting me and inviting me. And one of the best things about giving the title for a talk several months in advance is that you actually have to write that talk and fill out what you mean by toward a field of interfaith studies. So here is my meditation on that, at least over the past couple of months. I want to start with somebody who did a talk at Yale some years back. In 2004, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright came to Yale Divinity School to deliver a talk called The Mighty and the Almighty on the subject of religion and foreign policy. In that talk and in the book of the same title that followed, Secretary Albright spoke of the profound shift in her understanding of foreign policy, from an endeavor where religion was seen as somewhere between peripheral and irrelevant to one in which understanding the energies around religion was viewed as essential. She had come of age in an era that celebrated modernity, a time in which the best sociologists assumed that the process of modernization was inherently linked to secularization. She speaks of it as a historical moment where foreign policy specialists studied George Kennan and Dean Acheson, paid close attention to the political tides of nationalism and socialism, and rarely mentioned God in public or viewed religion as a force to be reckoned with at all. When Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington wrote The Clash of Civilizations in the mid-1990s, Albright says, "We did all we could to distance ourselves from that theory. We had in mind a future in which nations and regions drew closer as democratic bonds grew stronger, not a world splitting apart along historic fault lines of culture and creed." Even the foreign policy issues Secretary Albright dealt with directly in the Clinton administration, the Balkans War, the Middle East peace process, she and her colleagues viewed in secular terms: the rights of individuals, the dividing lines of land. 9/11 shifted the paradigm, showing that the path ahead would mix religion and foreign policy in profound ways. But it also cast a light backwards, illuminating how the foreign affairs issues of the 1990s, from the Balkans and the Middle East to Northern Ireland and South Asia, were shot up with religious energies. In her book, Secretary Albright recalls many situations from her foreign policy career that, in retrospect, had profound religious dimensions. She talks of how the visit of Pope John Paul II to Poland energized the anti-communist movement there, and how the return of the Ayatollah to Iran in 1979 took the entire American foreign policy establishment by surprise. She writes about the emergence of faith-based extremist movements like Joseph Kony's Lord's Resistance Army and Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, the religious issues that complicated the Middle East negotiations, and the faith-fueled conflicts raging across the world. It turns out that those 1960s-era sociologists were wrong. The world is not necessarily headed down a path of disbelief. One particularly prominent secularization theorist, Peter Berger, revised his view in this pithy line: "The world is as furiously religious as ever, and in some cases, more so than ever." Arguably, the issues around religion may be more important in the next 20 years than they were in the past 20. There is a great deal of attention paid to whether nations undergoing transitions to democracy, Tunisia, Egypt, Iraq, Libya, soon Syria, perhaps Bahrain, can build stable representative governments and economies that employ a reasonable percentage of their populations. But even a quick glance at the New York Times on any given day reveals that an equally important question is how groups who orient around religion differently within those nations are going to relate to one another. Sunni Shias and Kurds in Iraq, Sufis and Salafis in Tunisia, Ikhwanis, secular Muslims, and Christians in Egypt. And this is a dynamic that's true beyond the Middle East. Who knew there was a group called Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, and that that nation's storybook democratic opening last year would be marred by violence between its Buddhists and its Muslims? Nations undergoing a transition to democracy are likely the most vulnerable to this type of interreligious civil conflict, precisely because the sectarian-oriented authoritarian governments that ruled before gave favor to some groups, think Sunni Baathists in Iraq or Alawites in Syria, fomenting reprisals when those dictatorships are overthrown. But this is a dynamic that's relevant to other parts of the world also. Tensions still simmer between the Catholics and Protestants of Northern Ireland, as well as the Serbian Orthodox Christians and the Bosnian Muslims of the Balkans. Christian-Muslim conflict within Nigeria is a significant problem, and sectarian violence between Sunnis and Shias in Pakistan has resulted in the outright murder of hundreds of mostly Shia Muslims last year alone. And the growing Muslim populations of Europe are increasingly being met with restrictions on their religious liberties, the banning of headscarves, the limiting of mosques, and vicious nativist movements. Furthermore, this is not simply an over-there problem. The United States is the most religiously diverse nation in human history and the most religiously devout nation in the West at this moment of global religious conflict. Mitt Romney's run for president revealed ugly anti-Mormon strains among some segments of the American population. In the past several years, dozens of mosques have encountered opposition by city councils and citizens groups, some of it violent, as in arson. 50% of Americans report that they would not vote for an atheist or humanist for president, and more than a few atheists in recent years have made their name and sold a lot of books by taking an aggressively hostile stance against all forms of religion. Moreover, we have diaspora groups from each of the communities fighting elsewhere right here in America, often living cheek by jowl. These groups feel deeply connected to the fate of their co-religionists elsewhere. Simply put, when violence occurs between Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East, tension rises between Jewish and Muslim groups in the Midwest. The term diversity in professional and educational circles in the United States is frequently used as positive on its face, needing no justification. Diversity is our strength. Diversity enriches us. These are common statements. You probably heard them at freshman orientation, those of you who are students here. But Harvard professor of comparative religions, Diana Eck, points out that diversity is simply a demographic fact, a situation in which people with different identities live in close quarters. The term says nothing about how those people get along with one another. Frankly, if all we knew about religious diversity was the stories carried on the international news, it would be hard to conclude anything but that religious diversity, in many parts of the world at least, is a recipe for conflict. Recent social science provides a window into the complexities around diversity. Robert Putnam, in his Skite lecture, found that the most common result of diversity within a city is that it causes people to quote-unquote hunker down, isolating themselves and eroding the social capital of the broader community. This creates a vacuum for groups invested in spreading prejudice or building barriers to sow the seeds of division and conflict. And religious conflict can be especially deadly. Not only do the participants believe they are fighting for cosmic reasons, where death may be welcomed as martyrdom, but religious communities are the largest repositories of social capital in many civil societies, providing endless amounts of energy, people, and resources to mobilize. What if that social capital between religious communities could be bridged, and people who orient around religion differently could be convinced to cooperate with one another? What if the cosmic narratives of religious traditions could be nudged to consider the religious other as a partner in the quest for the kingdom on earth? Many of the great social movements of the 20th century, Hind Swaraj in India, the civil rights movement in the United States, the struggle in South Africa, had a profound interfaith character. What if the great line from the 1893 Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago, from now on, the great religions of the world make war no longer on each other, and instead on the giant ills that afflict humankind? What if that line could be made a reality? This is the hope of the interfaith movement. There has been a dramatic growth in interfaith activity over the past 20 years, linked to the increasing diversity that many people are now experiencing, and also to the prevalence of high-profile religious extremism and conflict. A half-century ago, few cities had any organized interfaith programs. Today, dozens have some sort of initiative, everything from interfaith councils to festivals of faith. Religious denominations have invited leaders from other religions to give keynotes at their gatherings. Local congregations have started interfaith exchange programs. Think tanks have commissioned task forces and issued reports. The United Nations launched a major interfaith initiative called the Alliance of Civilizations. Muslim and Christian theologians unveiled a document called A Common Word Between Us and You. Celebrated world religions author Karen Armstrong used her TED Prize to issue a charter of compassion, calling all religions to redefine themselves by that shared core value. Princes, prime ministers, and presidents have all in various ways lent their support to the interfaith cause. I remember standing in the Oval Office with President Obama at the first meeting of his inaugural Faith Council when he spoke of the importance of interfaith cooperation as a way to strengthen America's civic fabric and to show the world that conflict between faiths is not inevitable. The Academy has gotten into the act as well. The American Academy of Religion, the largest body for religion scholars in North America, recently made interfaith studies a permanent study group. Not only are there excellent interfaith activities run by diversity offices and chaplaincies, but universities have held conferences, started classes, and supported research on interfaith cooperation. Yale, unsurprisingly, is a leader in this area, with the presence of faculty and staff like Sharon Kugler, Omar Bajwa, who's here with us today, Miroslav Volf, Skip Stout, Joseph Cummings, a partnership with the Tony Blair Faith Foundation. I could go on, but this is undoubtedly a center of this type of work in America and the world. So I've been involved in interfaith work for some 15 years. When I was just starting out in the late 1990s and happened to mention the term interfaith to someone, I mostly got met with a blank stare. When I tell someone now I run an interfaith organization, there's a good chance that they shoot me a knowing look, followed by statements like, "It's so great that you are working to support people's spiritual journeys," or "I believe in all religions too," or "My fiance is Muslim and I'm Jewish and we can't find anyone to do our wedding." We've gone from no recognition of a term to 100 different definitions of what it might mean, some of them contradictory. As the activity in this area increases, one crucial role for the Academy to play is to give some shape and focus to what is clearly an emerging field of research, study, and practice. So what follows is my attempt to do so. Interfaith studies in the Academy would examine the multiple dimensions of how individuals and groups who orient around religion differently interact with one another, and the implications for communities, civil society, and global politics. Clearly, it would be an interdisciplinary field. A psychologist might research how individuals who grow up in a religiously homogeneous environment experience and cope with moving to religiously diverse surroundings. A political scientist could study why some nations have been more effective in absorbing religious minorities than others, or why politics is dominated by religion in some states and not in others, or perhaps the relationship between the two. A historian would draw parallels between the relatively tolerant empires of medieval Islam and the democratic nation-states of contemporary North America. A sociologist might look at the role religious institutions play in assimilating immigrants. Philosophers might compare paradigms of pluralism. Theologians would elucidate how to be Christian or Muslim or Jewish amongst quote-unquote others. Professors of art and literature could choose to examine any of 1,000 great works that have been created at the crossroads of religious imaginations. Without a doubt, research projects like these exist in the Academy, but they are disconnected, published in separate journals and discussed independent of one another at different conferences and in different departments. Academic fields are useful because they are formal spaces for a group of colleagues to engage in long-term data gathering, sustained reflection, and extended discussion. It's a question not only of collecting things, but connecting them and cooperating together to decide what they might mean. Consider similar areas that have become fields, gathering scholars from different disciplines to inquire, connect, and apply. Urban studies, human and family studies, education, community development, social work. One thing that unites these fields is a strong practitioner dimension. Scholars in these areas ask and pursue critical research questions, but they also create programs of study that shape leaders who do in their areas. Social work departments educate social workers. Education departments train teachers. Urban studies departments train city managers, and so on. A major part of what interfaith studies would be about is nurturing a cadre of professionals, a group that I'm calling interfaith leaders. I'm defining an interfaith leader as someone with the framework, knowledge base, and skill set to help individuals and communities who orient around religion differently in civil society and politics build mutual respect, positive relationships, and a commitment to the common good. Put simply, an effective interfaith leader is one who can work with diversity to build pluralism. I'm defining diversity, again, along with Diana Eck, as simply the fact of people and groups with different identities living in close quarters. Pluralism is an achievement characterized by three things. Number one, respect for different identities. Number two, positive relations between diverse communities. And number three, a commitment to the common good. Diverse societies that achieve pluralism have a strong civic fabric, one that can withstand the provocations of extremists and haters, and are bridging their social capital in ways that can take on some of the toughest social problems of that society. But bridges don't fall from the sky or rise from the ground. People build them. And the people who are on the vanguard of such work, we call leaders. I want to imagine for a moment the kind of program that might educate and train interfaith leaders. And if you are wondering if I was the kind of geeky graduate student who, in the middle of writing my qualifying exams, would daydream of the type of courses I might teach one day, you are correct. I was indeed said geeky graduate student. Mira can attest to that. We were grad students together. I hope one day that universities across the country offer master's degrees in interfaith leadership. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'm imagining a concentration in an undergraduate program, a course sequence a student might take as part of a major in religion, political science, or international relations. The foundational course would be called Religious Diversity, Civil Society, and World Politics, and the first text that would be taught is Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. The first assignment would be to read Huntington alongside a week's worth of the New York Times and come to class attempting to argue against his thesis. If it is a typically bloody week between different religious communities, there will be far more that seems to illustrate Huntington than seemingly disproves him. This discussion will hopefully raise a series of questions that the rest of the coursework will attempt to answer. The first question is about religious trends. Huntington was one of the first prominent academics to say that the secularization theory was bunk, that religious identity was deeply ingrained in the human condition, and most of humanity was likely to identify most closely with their faith for the foreseeable future. 20 years after the Clash of Civilizations, what do we know about trends in religious identification? And not simply about the number of adherents of different religions across the globe, but also about religious diversity within cities, nations, and regions, and how people's religious orientations shape their attitudes towards everything from polio vaccines to separation of quote-unquote church and state to girls' schooling. The basic question is this: how devout and how diverse is our chosen area of interest, and how much is that likely to matter for issues of peace and stability there? The second question the Huntington conversation is likely to raise is whether conflict between communities who orient around religion is indeed inevitable, which Huntington frankly suggests. The third question is related to the second. If religious violence is not inevitable, in what situations have diverse communities coexisted and even cooperated? This question is best answered through the literature of three disciplines. One is history, simply reading about the instances where diversity has become coexistence or cooperation. Some of my favorite works along these lines include Yale University's Maria Rosa Menecal's The Ornament of the World, about medieval Andalusia, and Zachary Caramel's Peace Be Upon You. A second discipline which helps answer this question is political theory, which raises, I think, the hardest and most important questions when it comes to religious diversity. Namely, under what political and social conditions can communities who have very different ideas of what is good and lawful on earth, based on a set of cosmic convictions, live together in the same society? Professor Shapiro and I were discussing this before coming up here. Let me give just one brief example from the nation from the nation in which I was born. Many Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains believe that all of life is holy and should be unharmed, all animals and some vegetables. They share a society, India, with about 140 million Muslims who believe that slaughtering goats on certain days is holy and eating meat on most other days is a very good idea. How can these groups, with such basic differences anchored in cosmic convictions, share a society together? These are the kinds of questions that Michael Walzer, Alfred Steppen, and John Courtney Murray ask in their works of political theory. Finally, sociology. What do we know from people doing empirical work, both ethnographic and quantitative, about how communities who orient differently around religion might get along? Robert Putnam and David Campbell's American Grace asks the question how America as a nation that is both religiously diverse and religiously devout has remained largely quote-unquote tolerant, even during times of religious tension and conflict elsewhere. Pax Ethnica takes an ethnographic look at a range of highly diverse cities around the world and asks what makes places like Flushing or Marseille largely cooperative. Brown University professor Ashutosh Varshney has a hugely important study of India called Ethnic Conflict and Civic Life, in which he asks the question, why do some cities in India remain calm during times of communal tension when other cities explode in violence? The answer is surprisingly simple. the existence of civic networks, Rotary clubs, and the like that bring people from different backgrounds together on a regular basis seems to be the single biggest difference between stability and violence. That answer, incidentally, highlights why I am calling this a program in interfaith leadership. Civic networks that bring diverse people together don't fall from the sky. Somebody starts them. Somebody continues them. They are built by people, by leaders. A second course in this sequence would be case studies in religious violence and interfaith peacebuilding. This course would present actual instances of religious diversity becoming either conflict or cooperation, and analyzing the role that leaders played in either fanning the flames of conflict or building the bridges of cooperation. Texts would include Mark Juergensmeyer's Terror in the Mind of God, the multi-volume Fundamentalism Project by Scott Appleby and Martin Marty, David Smock's Interfaith Dialogue and Peacebuilding, and interfaith case studies developed by Harvard's Pluralism Project. Key leadership texts by scholars like Ronnie Heifetz and Howard Gardner would also be employed. Case studies would include everything from how Osama bin Laden mobilized a set of Muslims to build a religious extremist organization like Al-Qaeda, to how Martin Luther King Jr. mobilized racially and religiously diverse people to build a civil rights movement. Some case studies would come right off the front pages of the New York Times, and students would be asked, if you were in Grand Island, Nebraska, when Latino and African American Christians staged a walkout of a factory because the Somali Muslim workers had recently won a schedule change to accommodate Ramadan hours, how would you lead in that community? That question, how would you lead, would be at the heart of the discussion in this class. Akin to the Harvard Business School case study model, which presents students with real-life situations faced by companies and asks them what they would do if they were in charge, this course would constantly be asking the students, how would you strengthen interfaith cooperation in this particular case when diversity seems to be tending towards conflict? A third course I would require is something along the lines of perspectives in religion. In some ways, this is a typical course offered in most religious studies departments on the nature of religion, with readings by Jose Casanova, Talal Assad, Clifford Geertz, Mircea Eliade, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, Marshall Hodgson, Peter Berger, Rudolf Otto, Paul Tillich, Houston Smith, Stephen Prothero, and the classics, Mark Weber and Durkheim. Students would examine various theories of religion. Otto's notion that at the center of religion is an experience that is wholly other, something he calls the numinous. Tillich's view that what religion is really about is ultimate concerns. Cantwell Smith's writings on religion being best understood as cumulative historical traditions, and the term faith being best defined as the relationship that individuals and communities have with various dimensions of that tradition. Berger's emphasis on institution as the plausibility structures that pattern human activity, and his key insight that what modernity really does is pluralize, moving personal identity from fate to choice, making the internal life of human beings far more complex now than in pre-modern times. Students would put scholars like Houston Smith and Stephen Prothero into dialogue with each other. Are religions actually quite similar, as Smith suggests, or really very different, as Prothero writes? This course will widen perspectives and debunk common myths, like the idea that sacred scripture somehow gets up and walks around by itself, with no assistance from human interpreters. The final course I would require is a course called Theologies of Interfaith Cooperation. Students would read theologians and ethicists from a range of faiths, including secular humanism, who advance interpretations and narratives of their traditions that speak to positive relationship building with the other. This would include Khalid Abu el-Fadl, Farid Essaq, Umar Abdallah, Fazlur Rahman, and Ingrid Mattson out of Islam, Jonathan Sachs, Orr Rose, Mark Gopin, and Abraham Joshua Heschel out of Judaism, Mahatma Gandhi and Swami Vivekananda from Hinduism, Paul Nitter and Hans Kung from Catholicism, Miroslav Volf and Brian McLaren from Protestant evangelical Christianity. The key question of the course would be, how have theologians from a range of traditions stitched together interpretations of scripture, stories, heroes, and historical moments from their key sources to articulate a coherent narrative of positive relationship with the religious other? And how do they navigate some of the most challenging and complex questions? What do Jewish theologians do with the idea of chosenness in relating to the religious other? How do evangelicals view the idea of Christ as the exclusive path to salvation in light of admiring the spiritual example of someone like the Dalai Lama or Gandhi? The core idea here is that positive relations between those who orient around religion differently does not require leaving religion aside. Some of the great interfaith leaders of the 20th century, Gandhi and King, to name two obvious ones, built bridges with people of other faiths precisely because of their respective Hindu and Christian faiths, not despite them. Interfaith leaders need to be fluent in the theology of interfaith cooperation of their own tradition and literate in such theologies in other traditions. After this four-course sequence, I would require 2 electives that could be taken from a range of options. Some students might want to do a deeper dive into religion by taking courses in Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, etc. Some might want to focus on a particular region, the Middle East or South Asia. The capstone project would be one of 2 things. One, the design and implementation of a local interfaith project that puts into practice key theories and skills of interfaith leadership learned through the coursework. Or 2, to write a program proposal for dealing with an interfaith challenge elsewhere in the country or world. The key requirement in both cases is that they must make use of interfaith leaders in civil society to build pluralism out of diversity. As I conclude, I want to return to the place where I started. In The Mighty and the Almighty, Secretary Albright noted, "When I was Secretary of State, I had an entire bureau of economic experts I could turn to, and a cadre of experts on non-proliferation and arms control. I did not have similar expertise available for integrating religious principles into our efforts at diplomacy." It's an important reminder that foreign policy is ultimately not carried out by paradigms. It's carried out by people. This is the reason that the program I'm outlining above emphasizes nurturing leaders. When those leaders graduate, they will need jobs. And I think one of the places that ought to hire them is the State Department. But it's far from the only place. Staff of international development organizations, World Vision, USAID, Islamic Relief, that are attempting to spread polio vaccines in South Asia or anti-malarial bed nets in sub-Saharan Africa better be aware of the religious energies in those places. YMCA executive directors and school principals in inner-city Minneapolis would do well to know something about the faith practices of the Somali Muslims, the Hmong shamanists, and practitioners of Native American religions in the surrounding area. City officials in rapidly diversifying cities like Atlanta, Houston, and Birmingham should have some knowledge of the Hindu customs of their Indian population. And it would be a double tragedy if the first time that journalists from Milwaukee news outlets visited the local Sikh temple was in the immediate aftermath of a white supremacist shooting 6 people there. I think it's useful to say a few words about what I have chosen to emphasize in my imagined program and what is left out. This is a program of study that focuses on how communities who orient around religion differently are going to relate to one another within cities, nations, regions, and the world at large, and that seeks to nurture leaders who are able to build bridges between these different groups. The emphasis is on the public dimension of religion, how its narratives promote conflict or cooperation, how its social capital is mobilized towards violence or community building. There is little in what I have articulated above that deals with personal and pastoral matters, things having to do with people's spiritual journeys, personal sins, the religious symbolism of their wedding ceremonies. I think it is fair to say that most of the current interest in interfaith cooperation is the latter, the personal, the pastoral, the spiritual. Memoir is probably the most common genre in the literature of the movement. Personal storytelling is amongst the most common practices. Questions about one's own religious or spiritual identity in relation with others in personal, pastoral, intimate ways are always highly salient at interfaith gatherings. Not only is this to be expected, it's beautiful. It is the human family figuring out its next steps in an era of frequent and intense interactions with people of different identities. To paraphrase Wilfred Cantwell Smith, if faith is to be lived at all in the future, it will be lived in intimate relations with others. But if life is to be lived at all in the future, it will be lived in cities nations, and regions that are highly diverse. And if leaders who are making faith a bomb of destruction continue to win, then the various intimacies of more prosaic interfaith existence, what it means to date or marry someone from a different community, how to raise children in a multi-religious household, are moot. I think the civic and political questions around religious diversity are so challenging, and the need to nurture a critical mass of leaders who can build pluralism out of diversity in the public square so great, that tilting the academic dimensions of this field of interfaith studies towards the public square rather than the private sphere is warranted. I should hasten to add that these types of programs are growing as well at places like the Berkeley Center at Georgetown, the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame, right here in the Faith and Globalization program at Yale, and many of these are funded by the Luce Foundation. Moreover, precisely because personal, pastoral, and spiritual matters are so present and prevalent, conversations around the private matters of interfaith existence are happening, and expertise in this area is building. College chaplaincies are on the vanguard of this, and it is no surprise because people like Sharon Kugler, Omar Bajwa, and the rest of the chaplaincy here at Yale are constantly dealing with the personal questions of young people figuring out their identities in relation to people of other identities. Hospitals, wedding halls, pastors, spiritual writers, and counselors, all of these individuals and institutions are growing quite expert at dealing with interfaith questions in people's personal, pastoral, and spiritual lives. And unsurprisingly, there are academic programs that are emerging to train professionals in what I'm calling the more private sphere of interfaith existence. In some ways, this is a response to a market. People require the services of institutions and individuals who can engage their private needs around the intersection of personal spiritual identity and diversity. And it is all to the good. What I fear is that as the literature, expertise, and programs in this area grow, the field of interfaith studies will begin to look like an endeavor focused mostly on the private domain. The civic and political questions of how groups who orient around religion differently will continue to be engaged, but in separate departments and journals and programs of study, as they are now, without the benefit of cooperation and connection, without the benefit of a field. So let me end with the obvious, that the issues around interfaith studies are both about private lives and the public sphere, and one key question is how to connect the two. A Jewish undergraduate may first become interested in interfaith cooperation because she is dating a Hindu or finds the spiritual discipline of a Muslim to be inspiring. By taking the concentration I outline above, she will hopefully have more knowledge and skills with which to navigate her private life, and also the expertise to build pluralism out of diversity in the realm of civil society and politics. And I'll end with an image and a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., which is, I think, the ultimate goal of this endeavor. He called it the World House, and he imagined humankind as a large family who had received an inheritance, this single house. And imagine us all going there on this island and looking at each other and realizing that we are black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Protestant and Catholic, Gentile and Jew, and all of us, because we can never again live apart, have to somehow learn to live in this house in peace. That house needs architects. Those architects need training. That's why we need a field of interfaith studies. Thank you.
Well, thank you for initiating such a what I hope will be a continuing discussion here of these themes with such a well put together and both provocative and in many ways though persuasive talk. We do have about 25 minutes or so for questions and comments. I will resist the temptation to use the prerogative of the chair to ask the first question, but I have one which I'll keep in reserve. But let some others first join us. Yeah.
Yes.
Why don't you say who you are?
Oh, my name is Ruben De Silva, Yale Divinity School, second year over there. Is it Mr. or Dr.?
Ibu.
Okay, Ibu. I had a question about, based on the experiences as a community organizer or an organizer of communities. Can you give us examples of how maybe you went about building not just interest, but maybe excitement in interfaith engagement?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you for that question. So, this is I think it's two categories, right? One's a knowledge base, and the other is a skill set. And I think in building bridges between religious communities, and the geeky term for this is bridging social capital between communities who orient around religion differently, is you have to have appreciative knowledge of those other communities. You have to be able to walk into a mosque, a synagogue, a church, an evangelical space, and be able to articulate what you admire about that tradition. The ability to say, I have great admiration for the way evangelicals build international relief organizations. That begins with knowledge, right? Is simply knowing those things. And one of the interesting things is the prevalence of the category religious literacy over the past 8 or 10 years by Stephen Prothero. I think religious literacy is a hugely important project. I just think it's incomplete. Adjust the facts approach along the lines of religious literacy doesn't cultivate the kind of appreciation and admiration I think that we need to live in a multi-religious society. I'll give you a quick example of this. So, to know the facts of a racially diverse society might be to know that 12% of America is African American. But actually, I would hope that people know more than that. I would hope that people know the great inventions by black scientists, the great literature by African American writers, the great feats by black athletes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think we need the same knowledge base when it comes to a multi-religious society. And I think that being an organizer or an interfaith leader begins with having that knowledge base. The other thing is having the skill set to be able to articulate those things to folks. So the skill is in having the language to mobilize people based on the dimensions of their traditions that they find important. Mercy in Islam, justice in Judaism, love in Christianity, the knowledge base to know the particular stories in Scripture around those key values, and the skills to be able to tell the stories that would bring folks from those communities into whatever project you're interested in.
You speak up a little so
Okay.
people behind you can hear you.
Sorry. My name is Christina. I'm also from the Divinity School. While your talk focuses on an undergraduate program, I imagine you might have some visions for what it would look like for secondary schools as well. Particularly, I'm curious about how you may envision us to start integrating this model in some appropriate way, particularly in secular secondary schools, not necessarily parochial schools.
Yeah. So I think that that's hugely important, and honestly, I'm just not smart enough to have gotten to that yet. And I'm being very serious about that, right? I've spent the last 10 years building an organization called Interfaith Youth Corps, and we focus on college campuses, and every sector of society has its own quirks and idiosyncrasies, and working with college campuses is its own set of practices, quirks, and idiosyncrasies. The quote-unquote barriers to entry on college campuses are of a particular type. The barriers to entry in secular secondary schools are of a second type, right? So my hope is that a field of interfaith cooperation would be much broader than an academic field of interfaith studies. It would include all sorts of nonprofit organizations, one of which would focus on interfaith literacy, interfaith cooperation in secondary schools. It's just not going to be my organization at this point in its history. There are some good resources on this, though, and I'll just give you a couple off the top of my head. So Charles Haynes at the First Amendment Center has done a great little monograph on a city in California, Modesto, that implemented a world religions course, and it's kind of a great little book on how that went. And a second is Diane Moore, who's at Harvard Divinity School, who focuses on religious diversity and religious literacy in secondary schools. So I would check those out.
Hi, my name is Emma Peterson. I'm also at the Divinity School.
I love it. That's right.
I was moved in reading from your earliest book, your own journey towards defining who God is to you. And I was also very moved that that in your very beginnings of activism, you were participating in a more secularized community. And in listening to the mission of the Interfaith Corps, I'm wondering if there is space for and room for participation from secular communities, and what that looks like, and how, once you have established this unity among people of different faiths, how you also reach out to secular populations.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a terrific question, and it's one that some smart person in just about every audience that I give a talk to asks. So thank you for being that smart person in this audience. So the answer to the question, I'll actually do a little bit of backtracking and say, when I kind of first conceived of Interfaith Youth Corps in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I wasn't smart enough to include secular humanists in it. And secular humanists kept showing up at the table, and frankly, having some of the skills of interfaith leadership that I spoke about with you, a knowledge base of different traditions, a skill set of storytelling, mobilizing, facilitating, that were as good, if not better, than some of the religious folks around the table. So finally, I just woke up and I was like, well, you're already at the table, you excel here, I need to create a theory of this work that includes you. And I think that's one of the reasons that I use the language, people who orient around religion differently, rather than the language of religious diversity or religious identity. A slight shift, but you folks at Yale appreciate such slight shifts in language, I understand. So I think secular humanists are at the table just like anybody else is. And where the rubber meets the road in this work, right, is, are you able to build bridges between people who orient around religion differently? That's where the rubber meets the road. So our model for this is not a representational model. It's not like, the joke is it's not a guys in funny hats model, right? It's a social entrepreneur model where what we're trying to do is inspire, nurture, educate, train a critical mass of people who can go into the public square and build civic bridges between groups who orient around religion differently. Whether you're a Hindu or a humanist or an evangelical or a Catholic, the only thing that matters is you are able to mobilize the resources of your tradition towards implementing that, towards that skill set. So let me give you two books. I'm feeling very professorial here. Greg Epstein, who's the humanist chaplain at Harvard, has a book called Good Without God, which articulates a positive relational view of humanism, and a great book, a memoir called Faithist by a guy named Chris Stedman just came out, which I just wrote the foreword to actually, which does the same thing. And let me just, as we are at a place that has a high view of language, let me just draw in a red marker around the term unity. Our view of this is it's not about unity, it's about relationships. And one of the things I was saying to Professor Shapiro earlier is that my favorite new line is a diverse democracy depends upon people who have deep disagreements on some important things, recognizing and working on their commonality in other important things, right? So evangelicals and Muslims view Jesus differently and view many issues in the world differently. Just because they have differences on A, B, and C shouldn't mean that they can't work together on X, Y, and Z. And in my view, the work of building pluralism is recognizing where differences are and working together on commonality. And I just don't know how you have a diverse democracy without that.
Yes, sir.
One of the,
Just can you say who you are?
yeah, Steve Liga. I sometimes feel when I'm among sociologists of religion and people more politically oriented, that they sort of slice off, their layer of this issue. And it's like what most of us do. We pick out what's most familiar to us. And so I liked that when you brought this issue of this fragmentation. And I wonder if you've had contact or thoughts about how you would bring in, you have these immense resources of comparative theologians and people who've been involved in interreligious dialogue for 50 years, like Ponikar, Catherine Cornell, and Frank Clooney, and all those people.
Oh, you are so close to my heart right now. These are my favorite people, yes.
And from a very different direction, there's this immense knowledge base from social psychology about how you put together groups that are divided as in groups and out groups, and mechanisms
Yeah.
that will dissolve that. I mean, there's a lot of literature
Yeah.
on these kinds of
Yeah,
things.
I think this is huge. So this is one of the reasons that I outlined a course, a program of study, right? And the 4 courses that I would require in my geeky vision of this are 2 courses are about the role of public religion in the world, to quote Casanova, right? And 2 are very much about about the heart of religious traditions. Rudolf Otto, Paul Tillich, Cantwell Smith in a Principles of Religion, in a Perspectives on Religion course, and then a course on Theologies of Interfaith Cooperation. So I think if I had one, this isn't a critique, this is a marriage. And I think what you're proposing is a marriage, right? I think you're right that there are plenty of sociologists of religion who view religion instrumentally as simply repositories of social capital. And the way they talk about them to religious people and people who work with religious traditions feels functionalist, feels instrumentalist, right? And this is actually, I did a talk at Harvard Divinity School a few months ago that Frank Clooney was the chair of, and he said to me that the Kennedy School folks had been, calling over to the Divinity School more and more to say, can you bring your religion types here, because we're recognizing the importance of religion in politics and the public square. And Frank Clooney, who is maybe the nation's most prominent comparative theologian, says, I'm only going to come if you take religion seriously, right? You have to convince me that you understand that this is about the deepest heartfelt motivations of large swaths of humankind. It's not just about moving lines on maps. On the other hand, and I've had this conversation with Professor Clooney, if the people who are able to, who look at the role that religion plays in the public square, have the types of methodologies and paradigms that you hint at, paradigms of cooperation versus conflict, etc., that can in fact be very powerful and useful. I think that the bridge here is in what we at Interfaith Youth Corps call a theology of interfaith cooperation, which is to say to a Frank Clooney, listen, within religions are theologies, are resources that articulate how within that tradition it is of great significance to participate positively in a diverse public square. This is why 7 of the 8 Ivy League schools were founded by religious communities, right? There are 230 Catholic universities in America. These are institutions founded out of the inspiration of a particular heritage that engage positively in a diverse public square. So I think the bridge between people whose particular focus is religious traditions and people whose particular focus is the sociology of religion is a theology of interfaith cooperation that comes within different traditions, but that applies itself to a diverse world.
Hi, my name is Alyssa Jitani. I am not at the Divinity School. I'm actually at the School of Management. So I was really interested by your comment about building beyond the private area into areas in the public realm, whether it be business or politics, or the myriad of other areas to be in. How do we translate a lot of this, talking about paradigms and different theories to what can we do? This is what we spend a lot of time thinking about in business school, so perhaps that's my prejudice, but what can we do in terms of our daily activities, the way we are interacting currently to achieve some of those goals out of the class?
So I think that in a lot of ways, the pedagogy of the Interfaith Studies program that I laid out is more similar to business school pedagogy than anything else. And I hinted at it in the talk, right? You take particular case studies of communities whose religious diversity is tending towards conflict. Just as you would take in a business school setting, you would take a case study of a company that was hemorrhaging revenue or hemorrhaging clients, and you would ask the question, if you were CEO of this company, what would you do, right? You would ask the question, in Grand Island, Nebraska, when Somali Muslims staged a walkout because the schedule of the factory that they worked in was not accommodating Ramadan hours and won a concession, and then in response, the Latino and African American Christians staged a walkout because the concession meant a shift in the schedule such that they received 15 minutes less pay. If you were a pastor in Grand Island, Nebraska, what's the sermon you would preach on Sunday? Right, so I think one answer to your question is to ask very real case study questions of when an area of religious diversity explodes into conflict, what would you do as a leader? What do you do in democratizing Myanmar? And part of the definition of democracy is the ability of groups to articulate their goals in the public square instead of simply a state kind of suffocating everything. What do you do in democratizing Myanmar? If you were Aung San Suu Kyi and your primary focus was on elections, and all of a sudden this violence erupts between Buddhists and Muslims in a region of Myanmar, how much attention would you pay to that? What speech would you give the following week about that, right? A case study model. I think the second thing the second part of your question, or the second half of it, is in our kind of prosaic existence, in our day-to-day existence, what can we do to deal with interfaith cooperation? So here's an example of this. The fact is, religious prejudice is rife in our culture, and it's almost offhand. And it was definitely offhand during the presidential election. And if you're in Mississippi, comments about Barack Obama being a secret Muslim are probably not that strange. And if you're in New Haven, there's a reasonable chance that comments about Mitt Romney's magic underwear and Mormonism are probably not that strange. And I think part of what you do as an interfaith leader is you know that prejudice exists, and you have the knowledge base and language to deal with it, right? So at the dinner table, look, if somebody said something biased about South Asians or East Asians or black folks or gays or lesbians in a place like Cambridge, Massachusetts or New Haven, Connecticut, people would have the knowledge base and language and kind of radar screen to deal with it. But I watch religious prejudice go unchecked all the time, right? And it's simply a matter of, do people realize when somebody says in an airport security line, as I heard this morning, mad that there was a backup in the security line, damn Muslims. I'm like, really, dude? You know? It's a kind of thing in different ways, in various regions, is simply part of dinner table conversation. And I think part of what we can do is have a radar screen for those things and check them. I'm going to give you a great example of this. So, did anybody happen to catch Walter Kern's essay on the Mormon community in the New Republic some months ago? Really, really beautiful essay. And Walter Kern, of course, a great American writer, wrote Thumbsucker, wrote Up in the Air. He got tired of hearing in New Yorker and New York Times type media these kind of snide comments about Mormons. And so he wrote this beautiful article about how during a really challenging time during his adolescence, when his family was breaking apart, they converted for a period of time to LDS. And although the family moved away from it after some time, that experience of several years in the church had a dramatic strengthening effect within the family. And he was like, look, I wish that Charles Blow, who made an offhand, who's a New York Times columnist, who I quite like most of the time, made an offhand prejudicial reference to Mitt Romney's magic underwear. He's like, I wish that Charles Blow would view Mormon identity as something that deserves the same respect as Catholic or humanist or Muslim or black or gay identity. So that's the kind of thing I think all of us can do on a regular basis.
Yeah, at the back.
Yes. Ibu, thank you for your thoughtful talk. I'm Josiah Brown, and I'm a member of an interfaith family and also international family. And I wonder to what extent the Interfaith Youth Corps already has chapters in other countries, and if so, where? And if not, what are you anticipating in the years ahead?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So actually, 3 years ago, I would have happily told you all of our international work at Interfaith Youth Corps. And then we went through a strategic plan, and part of what the group of folks who did the strategic plan said to us is, listen, you guys are spread way too thin, and you think you're quite impressed with yourselves because you can say you've got stuff in Jordan and Israel and and India, et cetera. But the fact is, you're not doing a good job anywhere. So you have 35 staff and a $4 million budget, and what you really ought to do is choose an area to focus and try to build actual effective models in that area. And so we did a lot of pulling back, and it's not because we don't love going to India or Jordan or Israel. It's because we need to have a critical mass of impact somewhere, and we've chosen that critical mass of impact to be on U.S. college campuses. And there's a bunch of good reasons for that. Campuses as mini civil societies, campuses as places that nurture a society's leaders, et cetera. And it's got nothing to do with other places not being important. It's just got something to do with limited resources and the need to focus. I will say that, may there be dozens of interfaith organizations that focus on effective programs in all parts of the world. Our challenge for right now is U.S. college campuses and college students.
Hi, my name is Allie McKinney. I'm also a student at the Divinity School. You referenced the term the common good, and I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit. And specifically, I'm wondering, is there a process that's involved
Yeah.
in developing the substantive content of a shared ethic? It reminds me of the Dalai Lama's recent book, Beyond Religion, where he kind of undertakes this type of a project. Would that be a component of the interfaith education that you're envisioning? There may be some sense in which we might assume that we know what the common good is, or
Yeah,
we agree on
right.
certain elements of it, but are there hard issues? And
Yes.
particularly in your experience, what's the process like of reaching a shared understanding?
Okay. Super important question, and I think a very compelling view. So you're asking a question and you're offering a view, right, of what the common good might be, or a process to get to that, right? So I have spent some amount of time thinking about this in the past couple of years, and I think that this is exactly why literature and perspectives from political theory are critically important for a program in interfaith studies, is because people in different societies view the common good very, very differently, obviously. And I have a particular view of gun issues, and other people have other views, right? We share the same society. Now that actually means some basic but profound things. We pay taxes to the same government. When leaders get elected, we recognize that those leaders are empowered for a particular period of time to make laws, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? We convene around the same symbols, passports, and American flags, whatever it might be. So this is all to say that I think when I use the term common good, it has to be an idea of the common good that is broadly shared, as opposed to something that is particular. So, a term that political theorists and scientists often use is, what's the overlapping consensus for this? Okay, so when I say common good right now, part of what I mean is basic state institutions that we all recognize are necessary for all of us to function and thrive. A police force, garbage collectors, that in other societies in which particular communities are disempowered, the state institutions didn't pick up the garbage in Shia areas of Iraq at the same rate that they picked up the garbage in Sunni areas of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. So part of what Shias did was create their own civic institutions that did that kind of work for them, right? When Saddam is toppled, those civic institutions can easily be turned into effectively tribal armies. We can't have that happen in diverse democracies. We have to recognize that Muslims, Christians, and Jews have an investment in the common good of police forces, garbage collectors, et cetera, that take care of basic functionality for all of us. Now that's a really prosaic thing. Here's a higher level thing, civil rights, right? That we recognize that there's no such thing as Muslim civil rights in America, or Jewish civil rights, or African American civil rights. There are civil rights that belong to all of us, and that is part of the common good of America, and each community has a stake in supporting those broader common good principles that then protect all of us. Does that make sense? I don't have all the language for this yet, but what I'm pretty convinced of is that you can't have a definition of the common good that large swaths of people don't agree on. You have to have a definition, even if it's things as prosaic as we different communities are not going to invest in our own police force, which, by the way, is no small thing. There are plenty of developing countries in which different particularist communities basically have civic institutions that serve the needs of their community, and at times of communal violence, those civic institutions, the boys that, on Sunday morning were picking up garbage, on Tuesday afternoon are carrying pitchforks, right? So that idea of the common good, everything from functioning institutions that all of us contribute to broader principles that benefit all of us, it seems to me is very important.
Yes, ma'am.
Building on the question of the common good, I was quite surprised that you said that unity is not so important, it's about the relationships, especially now that we've identified that we do need a common good, so we do need some kind of unity. I'm wondering how that fits in with, like, on the one hand, we need disagreement in society, on the other hand, we need unity, and how much unity is built on, I guess, a distinction that, for example, Nicholas of Gonzalez makes in, like, 1942, and the Bachiki Day, he says, well, we have essential differences and inessential differences.
Yeah, right.
Based on faith and like, which basically comes from Islam, where we have rights and we have, like, essential differences between religions. So I'm wondering kind of like how that fits into trying to establish interfaith community and of like how much we need to make that distinction and how much unity is important.
Yeah. This is why you come to Yale to give talks, right? Because you get questions like this. Thank you for this. These questions are going to keep me up nights. So it depends on your definition of unity, right? And what I am suggesting is that the difference that the term unity frequently means large amounts of agreement on large amounts of things, right? And I'm suggesting that the term relationship means you and I can talk about X, Y, and Z really positively and recognize that A, B, and C we're going to argue about. So sometimes we'll bring that up and sometimes we'll just leave it off the table, right? So what I'm saying is Michael Walzer has this beautiful line that the challenge of a diverse society is to embrace its differences and maintain a common life. I've probably meditated on that line for 12 years, right? What does that line mean? And the best that I can do is that it means there's basic respect for the identities of different communities and individuals within a society. In other words, there's a sense that look, if you live in Afghanistan and you're a Hazara, you have a basic sense that people hate you and people disrespect you. If you live in Pakistan and you're an Ahmadi, you have a sense that people hate you, right? That is not a good thing for a society. It's a terrible thing if you're part of that community. It's also a terrible thing for the society. Diverse society cultivates a basic sense of respect, appreciation, and knowledge base for its diverse communities. And this, by the way, is obvious, right? I mean, I used to watch a lot of ESPN SportsCenter. I have a 5-year-old, which means I watch a lot of Dora and Diego and Nickelodeon Jr. And, there is a multicultural themes are front and center which I think is a really good thing. From the get-go, our society, even on commercial television, is teaching kids the appreciation of Spanish language words, right? Probably half the shows on Nickelodeon Jr. have explicit multicultural themes. Little Bill, right? Like even any of you have young kids, is this like, you know what I'm talking about, Mira? Do you let your kids watch TV? Some. Look, on the Fresh Beat Band, the guitar player and the drummer is the girl, and the MC is the white guy. Like that's deliberate, right? We're cultivating a sense of multicultural appreciation in our society. So respect and appreciation of diverse identities is part one. relationships between different communities is part 2, and a commitment to the common good, the sense that a strong America, both in simply its functionality and in its principles, benefits all of us, and therefore we have some commitment to that in the form of tax dollars, in the form of voting, in the form of a robust notion of citizenship. Mira, ask me a hard question.
Well, your comment about young children made me think about an issue which I'm dealing with right now, which is raising kids in an interfaith context. And so when you have a particular faith tradition or several faith traditions within your family, how you're educating your kids about that, but also at the same time making them aware that there are other people who don't share that same tradition. And so wondering if you had any thoughts about that and recommendations of experts, authorities.
Yeah. So I just wrote a book called Sacred Ground, and the last chapter of the book is called American Muslim Child, which is about, stories of Zayd. So I'll tell one quick story, which I tell in that chapter. So we're at our secular Hindu neighbor's house for Diwali, and my son, who's 3 at the time, Zayd, says Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim before eating, which I am so thrilled about. I'm like, he knows it, he says it outside of the home. Then he looks at his Hindu friend Tarun, and he's like, you have to say Bismillah before eating. And I'm like, no, he doesn't, And then Tarun knows how to play this game. He's like, I'm not saying it, Zayd. So what does Zayd do? Says it louder, right? You have to say, and I swear to God, Tarun's parents look at Shanaz and me and they're like, we thought you weren't those type of Muslims, And I'm saying to my son, and 60 people in their most fabulous Indian gear are staring at my 3-year-old shouting at Tarun, you have to say Bismillah. And so, Zayd gets up and starts taking off across the room. I'm like, this is not good. So I intercept my son and I whisper in his ear. By the way, my wife is shooting me this steely-eyed look, I brought the cupcakes, you're the religion guy, you take care of this, And I just kind of comes out of me. I say to Zayd, we're saying Bismillah for Tarun, right? And what occurs to me, 5 hours later in that small space when you get to think as a parent, which is about 20 minutes long every day, is what I have to teach my kid is that he comes from a particular religious tradition that has something to say about relationships with people from other religions. And yes, there are very hard conversations to have. We believe that the Shahada and Islam is the fullness of truth, right? We also believe that having the fullness of truth means certain responsibilities and certain ways of relating with people who are different. And that is a huge part of the definition of being Muslim. So, I imagine that when Zayd gets a lot older, there's meaning 8, 9, 10, we're going to have questions. We sent Zayd to, I'll tell you another quick funny story. So we sent Zayd to a Catholic preschool, which takes Catholicism quite seriously, which we were happy about. Lord's Prayer before meals, PA announcements on the saints, etc. And so one day we're in the park and Zayd sees a statue, and he thinks it's the statue that's associated with this local coffee shop called Julius Meinl. So he says, I'm going to go look at Julius Meinl. He runs over there and he says, Mommy, it's not Julius Meinl, it's Jesus, And the whole park is staring at us, right? And I'm like, my son is able to identify 100 different types of Jesus statues, I view that as part of being a Muslim in a religiously diverse society. In other words, Islam has ideas of positive relationality which are ingrained in the tradition. And my job is to emphasize those things. Does that solve the other hard problems? No, I don't think so. But I think what it does is it gives us a fulcrum of emphasis of how you can be both particular within a tradition. And that's really important to me, right? Is that it's not, I'm not saying it has to be important to everybody, but it's important to me for my children to know that you are part of a particular tradition, not just some universal spirituality thing. You are part of Islam, a 1,400-year-old tradition, the tradition of your ancestors, and being part of that tradition means something for how you relate to people from other traditions.
You get.
I'm Kim. I'm an undergraduate here, and I was wondering, what ways undergraduates at Yale could become involved with Interfaith Youth?
You know, you want to come to an Interfaith Leadership Institute. Basically, what we do, a huge part of what the organization does, is we run 4 Interfaith Leadership Institutes a year. We're doing one in 2 weeks in Atlanta. I'll be super impressed if you can get it together to get to that. But you know, we did one at USC a few months ago. We do one in Chicago every summer, which is where we're based, and it's delegations of students from different campuses across the country who come and do kind of a 4-day intensive in the knowledge base and skill set of interfaith leadership. And the chaplaincy here, you know, ought to pay for you to come. You in a delegation. Omar Badra, who's the Muslim chaplain, was here earlier. But see me afterwards. But ifyc.org, under Interfaith Leadership Institutes, and you know, students from, I don't know, 150 or 200 campuses have come to these things.
Hi, my name is Genevieve. My question is about how do you think the religious nuns, or like people who don't affiliate with any religious tradition, fit in the Interfaith?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. So, and I think it's related to the question that was asked earlier. So I think in a couple ways. One, if you proactively identify as a secular humanist, or then part of what you are doing is proactively placing yourself within a tradition that has an awful lot to say about diverse democracies, positive relations with different communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So in a way, that's easy, and we get a lot of those. 2, I think, so second category of things to say, there are 2 doorways into Interfaith Youth Corps or interfaith stuff in general. Doorway number 1 is personal identity. This matters to me as a Hindu or a Jew or a humanist or an evangelical or a Catholic. Doorway number 2 is civil society and politics. This might not matter to me in my personal identity, but it matters in the public sphere, and therefore I'm interested. So I think nuns would be able to walk through either or both of those doors. The first one, they have to articulate for themselves in what ways do they have a personal stake in interfaith cooperation, right? They might do it from a perspective of humanism. They might do it from a perspective of spirituality. They might not care about religion at all, but they're tired of having their Mormon and Muslim friends maligned, and that gives them a personal stake. I think 2 is, you know, part of the definition of being an educated and active citizen is this issue is going to matter, and developing knowledge and skills around it are good for the purpose of being educated and active in a democratic society. Is that?
I'm one of the many divinity students in the room. And I really appreciate that you brought up the sort of issue that's important for many religious people to be in a particular tradition and be very aware of their particular. And I'm curious to know what you think about the potential for awareness of those particularities, both in one's own tradition and in other traditions, as sort of a resource for fostering the positive relationality.
Yeah. I mean, I really think this is it from my point of view. I think this is the question you're asking. If it's not, correct me. This is theologies of interfaith cooperation, right? This is the ability to stitch together scripture, stories, heroes, historical moments, et cetera, from the key sources of a particular tradition that ask and answer the question, how do I relate to the religious other, right? By the way, these stories obviously exist. We're not making them up. I'll give a key story in just a moment, but I'll say, in my view, theologies of interfaith cooperation are analogous to theologies of environmentalism or theologies of racial reconciliation in this way, that they have for a long time existed within traditions, but it's the needs of particular historical moments that make them more salient. So during the 1950s and 1960s, during the apartheid years in South Africa, for example, there were theologians who came up with things like the Kairos document, right, which was what Christianity had to say about different races, right? During the civil rights movement, there was a lot of theology there was a lot of multiracial theology and theologies of racial reconciliation because the historical moment called for it. we're in a historical moment that requires people to articulate a theology of interfaith cooperation. It's not that these things don't exist, right? Read Miroslav Volf's Encounter and Embrace. Read anything that Paul Knitter has written. Read anything that Hans Kung has written. I think the difference is, and this is also a story I tell in my book, Sacred Ground. If I were to ask any of you divinity school students, what's your theology of poverty alleviation? You would be able to quote me chapter and verse, right? In part because liberation theology from the time of Gustav Gutierrez, forward has been highly salient. And in part because you care about it and divinity schools teach it. If I were to say, what's your theology of interfaith cooperation, and I asked this question in a course I taught at Princeton Theological Seminary, I had 45 students staring at me like they'd never heard the term before. It's a matter of having that narrative salient. I'll give one quick example of this, simply to illustrate how this is not something we have to make up or graft onto our religions, how it's at the heart of it. So, when I teach in seminaries or divinity schools, and I say, what's your favorite Bible story? 4 out of 5 people will say the Good Samaritan story, right? So the classic, of course, what's the Good Samaritan story? The lawyer asks Jesus, how do I attain eternal life? Jesus says, you know how to do this. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Who is my neighbor, right? And of course, Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. What's the story? Traveler left for dead by the side of the road. Who passes him by? 2 leaders of his own faith, the priest and the Levite. Who stops? The Samaritan stops. Dresses the man's wounds with oil and wine, puts him on his mule, takes him to an inn, etc., etc. Who is the Samaritan? Frequently talked about as the other or the marginalized one, but there's something more specific. He's not just the other, he's the religious other. He's a person from a different religious community. And we know that Jesus disagrees with that other religion because elsewhere in the Bible there's the story of the woman at the well. Jesus articulates, I have a different theology. You have the wrong theology. So what's Jesus saying in this story? Don't follow the ethic of the people whose theology you disagree with when they leave the traveler by the side of the road. Follow the ethic of the person whose theology you disagree with, right? That's a story at the heart of the Christian tradition. The notion of follow the Samaritan, follow the religious other when their ethic is more beautiful than the ethic of the ones of your own faith. That's just one example of kind of a key text within a theology of interfaith cooperation.
I think we have time for one last question, so you're ready.
Should we take 2 of them together and then I'll be short?
Why not?
Yeah, we'll take both of you together and then I'll answer the easiest one.
My name's Daniel. I'm also at the Divinity School. And you talk about relationships as being kind of the crux of this work, it seems like. And I'm curious, because relationship is hard. Relationship requires conflict at times. And I'm curious if you could say more about some of the work you're doing and how relationship, some of the nuance and complexity of what that word and all that encompasses are being in relationship with each other, what that means.
Yes. That's probably the harder question. So
it is the harder question. I'm Dick. I'm just a retired guy, but to elaborate on his, I wondered if you could describe your bag of tricks for preventing your pragmatic approach to seeking common good in diversity from being hijacked by the theoretical and ideological differences.
Oh, yes. Those are both great questions. Okay, I will attempt to be as brief as possible. So here is the biggest trick I know. Learn what you admire about other traditions and tell those people that, regardless of what they start with. The single most important knowledge and skill in interfaith cooperation. Learn things you admire about other faiths. Songs that you like in their canon of songs. Pieces of scripture that you appreciate. Heroes that you admire. Right? Learn those things, and when you are in an interfaith encounter in which it's warranted, talk about them. Cokie Roberts on NPR had this great line the other day in her analysis of politics. She was like, let me tell you Bill Clinton's secret. It's very hard to dislike someone who likes you and who tells you they like you and who tells you what they like about you, right? So, look, I enter into interfaith situations as a Muslim and as an Ismaili Muslim, right? Not particularly, I'm not necessarily set up to be well liked by broad swaths of people. My bag of tricks is I know what I admire about the LDS Church, about evangelicals, about secular humanists, about Catholics, about Jews, and it's not made up. You know, it's not, I don't view it as a bag of tricks. I view it as part of my responsibility and part of my privilege as a human being and as a citizen to learn about things that I admire of people from other traditions. And notice, I'll just double click on that for 1 second and then get to your question. Notice that if are there any religious studies scholars in this room? People who read dead languages, for example? Okay, there was nothing in that, there was nothing in my program of study about that. Okay, so I think that to be an effective interfaith leader, you need a particular knowledge base of other traditions, and that knowledge base is on this side of knowing Sanskrit, Pali, and Greek, right? It is in having the type of knowledge and skills that enables you to build relationships with people from other backgrounds. That a good bridge to that next question, right? So yes, relationships are hard. So I will offer a very prosaic illustration. Every evening I come home at 6 o'clock and I have two choices to make. Do I want to get along with my wife or do I not want to get along with my wife? And it's actually, it's like literally an in front of me choice. If I talk about these sets of things, I will not get along with my wife. If I talk about these sets of things, I will get along with my wife. Now sometimes circumstances are such, or I am stupid, and I will somehow talk about these sets of things, this set of things. But I've now been married for 10 years, happily, glowingly, etc., and probably the single most important thing I've learned is I make a choice in how I relate to my wife every day. I know the topics of conversation, the times of those topics, the tone of those topics that are likely to be enriching, happy, etc., and I know when it's not going to be, right? So, and when I say relationship, I mean civic relationship. I think perhaps you are 5 layers deeper in the rabbit hole. And I mean the type of relationship that would have me look at somebody that I know I disagree with on really important things, and I'm making the decision to speak about what I admired from that tradition and the kinds of things that we can do well and profitably together. And I'm making the decision that we're going to have X type of relationship instead of Y type of relationship at that moment. Now, I will say one final thing about this. This is where the private and the public and that split is really, really important, okay? I do not feel, I'm going to be provocative about this, and then we can fight at the reception. Deal? That's what receptions are for. This is precisely why I'm articulating interfaith leadership as a civic, public, political endeavor whose purpose is to build relationships between people in the public square as opposed to a private or personal endeavor. If I learn, for example, when I spoke at a relatively conservative mosque some years ago, the guy who hosted me was like, man, you got to take your earrings out. Took my earrings out, right? That was an easy decision for me. The thinking was not, you have to know who I am when I walk into the room. I am not coming to speak at this mosque for my personal identity purposes. I'm coming to speak at the mosque to advance what I view as public enrichment. I'm also willing to do that around my Ismaili identity. if it turns out that articulating forthcomingly that I'm an Ismaili Muslim is not going to be useful to a particular public interfaith initiative, I won't hide it, I just won't emphasize it, right? We choose to emphasize things in our relationships with people. And if interfaith cooperation is articulated as a civic, a public, a political endeavor, then building bridges in the public square is paramount, which is to say we are willing to subsume other identities, whether it's personal identities, whether it's political opinions, etc., for the purpose of achieving the paramount goal, which is those relationships, those civic relationships.
Well, we really